take it away, Nelson.
Thank you very much, Michelle. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to read a poem and then I'll give it a little bit of background and talk about it. So with the magic of Zoom, I will try and make my screen share work. I'm not a great proponent of this tool. So if I can make it work, there you go. The first poem is called Buffalo Mourners, and I'll explain a little bit why later. Buffalo Mourners. We were like the buffalo girls, following the main path down the hill, realizing only a short distance in there was more to see than Karl Marx and the creator of New Labour. Paying homage to Douglas, smiling wryly at the piles of pens and the worst piece of maths in time and space. We arrive at your place, where we see simplicity. You're a diva, a king of pop, all the ingenuity of a Mozart, tied up with a cheeky punk bow, and maybe a piercing or two for good measure. Passing you by on the left, we continue our routine, round the outside, round the outside. We do not feel a do-si-do was appropriate under the circumstances. Why would I start with that? I'll actually stop sharing for a minute. So, as we know, Tower Hamlets is one of the Magnificent Seven. So the 7 graveyards created as commercial products as part of the Victorian era between 1831 and 42, I believe. Ken can correct me on that. And although Tower Hamlets is the most wonderful of the cemeteries, probably the most famous to anybody who hasn't really lived in London would be Highgate. And so I'm including something from outside for some context. And I think my first couple of years with the park were all about the park. And in the third year, although we had problems with lockdown, I also did some visits to all of the other parks to try to put some context in, see what the similarities are and see what makes Tower Hamlets different. And in my mind, special. We were talking about this beforehand. It's the park of all of the parks that that values nature above the stories. And now that Claire is a heritage officer, I think that we may see some changes that, but I think it's been brilliant at this point where we've had true stories. And that poem is referencing some of the residents of Highgate. And for anybody of a certain age, a difficult age like mine, you may remember Malcolm McLaren was in the charts with a song called Buffalo Girls. And they go round the outside, round the outside. And it references Douglas Adams, who's there, whose grave is a very simple granite block with just the number 42 written by it. So anybody who's read Hitchhiker's Guide, what is 6 times 9? 42. We realize the maths don't work, but never mind. And it's nice to put some context that different parks have different flavors. Tonight is an interesting time because I'm going to reference a little bit of Winston. This is not the beginning of the end. This is the end of the, sorry, this is not the beginning of the end. This is the end of the beginning. I am finishing my term as the poet in residence after 3 years, and 3 seems to be a popular number tonight. So I've been here for 3 years. I've done 3 Zoom sessions after tonight. We've done 3 walks in the park, poetry walks. We've done 3 community workshops that Michelle and I worked on together. And now I will be replaced by 3 artists in residence who will be adding a completely new dimension to the park, which is an exciting time for all. So I wanted to put the whole thing in a little bit of context and see where we are. For those who haven't been on a talk before, why the hell have we got a poet in residence in the first place? How the hell did I get to be here? Why do I use the word hell quite a lot? So that's a triad as well. So I wrote a book, my first novel, and I went to visit the sight lines of where the book was one day because I got made redundant. And I was walking around the city for one day. I went to Pimlico first, and then I came over to Tower Hamlets, where the hero of my book lives. And I needed to look around the location, and there were these strange people doing an open day in this graveyard. And I asked them what it was about, and I talked to Ken and probably at the time Dan, And they gave me some leaflets. I took them away, and I then put the park in my first novel. Roll the clock forward 2 years later after I produced the book, and I started working for Deutsche Bank, and we did a community social responsibility day where we came and worked in the park. And at the end of it, Dan said, "Does anybody have any sort of relationship with the park?" And I said, "I wrote a book, it's in." And we had a conversation about having a poet in residence. And the idea was that we defined some themes and that we then worked together to develop an artistic representation of the park that captures what people like, think, see, need. And a lot of this was focused very much on a point in time which is not the point in time now. The time now obviously is a little bit more difficult for everybody, and so I'll talk a little bit more about why I think it's more apposite now and why it's more important, and then we'll start to talk about writing poetry in general. But the thing about why that first poem is it's about storytelling. And I think the exciting part that I've only just found out tonight and met Claire is the heritage officer will give us the chance to bring more stories out about the park now. I wrote one poem in the first 2 years about Will Crooks, and I thought that was fascinating, that the man who came from the poorhouse was the man that went and reformed the poor laws. And I'm sure there are many stories in the park written in stone that we literally can play with. So that's exciting times ahead. I'd like to read a second poem now, and this is where I play around with screen share, so do excuse me. Hopefully you can see that. And this is called A Walk on the Wild Side. And this was about a walk we did with the team one summer evening when it was very, very hot, a hot summer, and we didn't think we'd see a single thing living, and the park was still just as alive. You would think, after weeks of punishing sun, that the graves would lay baked, naked, little more than structural remains, devoid of the green, deep green of growth. But one evening in July, we spy a plethora of wild flowers with discerning eye. Our guide, a modern-day oracle of delphiniums, pointing out each specimen with its pertinent features. And of course, we aren't alone. The butterflies so delicate, so slow as night nears, the squirrels always busy with no sign of fear, and the sly old fox who we chose to believe had not noticed us at all. This was our conceit. As we walked upon his hunting ground, we left only footsteps as advised, collecting the odd piece of strewn rubbish, cast carelessly among the ragworts, and then, first stepping carefully across the rocky remains into a secret hollow, the unexpected guest, Atropobolodona, the deadly nightshade, with black poisonous plums like dark tomatoes. We stand in awe and calculate the dose, 30 for an adult, far less for an unfortunate child, before moving on to fennel and teasels, cow parsley and cyclamen, transfixed by the abundance until the bell tolls 9. I think the park walks are such a fascinating way of engaging with the community, but also there is such a wealth of education, and it being the only, and I'll get this wrong, I think at one point it was 27 acres of woodland in Tower Hamlets Borough. I think it's now 31 acres of green space, including the Green Lanes areas. I know it's grown significantly. It is significant that there is a lack of green space, even as green as London is, for the number of people living there. And the park is so important. And I think sometimes, you know, the bits that are being done, when I was a kid at school, it was very easy to go to a farm or to go to somewhere green nearby and go on nature walks or go walking through a riverbed. And the kids and the residents around Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park don't have as much access. And this is why I'm so passionate about the park and about the amazing work Ken and the team do to then share that across. And so it drives the poetry quite easily. One of the things I wanted to do slightly differently tonight was talk about why write poetry, why now, and then talk a little bit about writing poetry, because I'd like to encourage you to do the same. So why do I write? Now, I've been writing for approximately 25 years properly, and getting more serious over the last probably 10. But I wrote for a need. My father and my son died 8 months apart, and that left me probably not the nicest person in the world, certainly not the most stable and most wonderful adult and human being you'd ever found. And I found writing was an amazing escape, and also an amazing way of capturing things. And I was terrible at it to start with. And my first degree was computing. I then did an MBA, and none of it was about how to write. And I had friends that were writers and authors and had done English degrees. Both my oldest two children have done English degrees, and my daughter will not read my poetry now because I'm a scientist. I don't do poetry. My son reads my books, which is quite nice. But it's a strange thing that always was for me, not so much an escape, but a channel. And I think escape makes it sound like there's something wrong. A channel gives you a way of giving you focus, of actually taking something and producing something beautiful that, well, I'll give you an example. I wrote a poem yesterday, and I briefly touched on something the last time I think we met on one of these, that one of my friends had, someone I worked with for many years, had put on Facebook that he was going to commit suicide. And suddenly I rushed around to get a lot of people together to contact him, find him, make sure he was all right. And then yesterday, someone else on LinkedIn told me that they'd lost a friend. Male suicide in England, in London, is very bad. The numbers have trebled during lockdown. 9 calls to London Ambulance Service a day have gone to 30. And I think a lot of this is about saying good mental practice, having a structure in which way to capture your thoughts actually not only helps you, but it helps other people. So it is kind of like mindfulness. It's another form of mindfulness. It is good mental practice, but it's dreaming while you're awake. It's a way of making patterns. I, as a mental model, am a natural pattern matcher. That's what makes me good at what I do. I see patterns in things. It's basically, I have a natural ability to see patterns, probably on the spectrum somewhere. But I think something that allows you to lock in an idea, and that's what poetry is. It allows you to lock in an idea. I'm going to share again. You'll excuse all of this stopping and starting. If I can move the screen forward. I was surprised by something, and I'll explain afterwards why. The poem is called Struck Down. And it's about when I walked back into the city in that short period when we could go back to our offices, and how the city was weird. Struck by the cycle, nothing new under soul, like Chumbawamba rewording Confucian epithets. In the falling, we find no failure. There exists a nobility in rising again. Dusting off, ready for the next battle, a future challenge, another hill to climb. In these post-pandemic days, no decimated world, but a sea change all the same. The streets ring with an empty echo as bells ring out, greeting or perhaps warning. Oranges and lemons revisited as Old Bailey speaks the great bell of Bow. The wind blows food wrappers like tumbleweed as returners rattle around the streets and Ghost Town plays in my mind. I feel the specials in every gritty wind blast. We all fell down, some will surface again, but not all. And not yet. The first 2 lines refer to the fact that I get knocked down, but I get up again. The famous one-hit wonder by Chumbawamba is basically a reworking of a Confucian idea that there is a nobility in rising again when you fall. And I actually saw some beautiful symmetry there, that we have seen some beautiful behavior and we've seen some appalling behavior during lockdown and during this epidemic. But some of the best behavior we've seen is people doing the right thing for the right reasons and showing the absolute strength of human spirit. And as much as we fail, we can only rise if we've fallen in the first place. So actually, there is an ability in rising, if that makes sense. It's also, poetry, a massively good way to take your frustrations out. I have a hobby. We all should have a hobby. In fact, I've got more hobbies than I have actually got time to perform. But in the last 5 years, I've visited every racetrack in the UK. I love horse racing, and I've had a website for it, and I'm going to turn it into a book. But the frustration of not seeing organised sport, there was a very funny image that went out just after they stopped live football matches, but the pubs were still open, and it was an image of Wetherspoons, and the pub was rammed, and they were watching Crown Green bowling, and the cheer that went up when one of the bowlers won the end meant they didn't care what sport it was. They wanted to participate in sport because sport is a great social leveler and a great social enabler. So I would like to share again. And tell me if this stopping, starting is okay with everybody. If there's any frustration, please do say. It's called I Missed the Track. It's very short. It's quite pithy. I missed the track, the smell of leather tack, the smack of lips on fine glass, the whack of whips on broad hips, as champion thoroughbreds flourish and finish with fleet foot. A Kodak moment on the line, a chilling freeze frame, and cold comfort as my horse and shirt come last. I still miss the track and I want it back. I think that, for me, summarizes some of the frustrations people are having, because it isn't just work, it isn't just school, it is those promised things that you always said you do them because you work hard so you can have the fun in between. And I think some of the problems we're having now, and why nature is such a godsend, literally, says the atheist, is that it's providing an outlet when we've had all our other outlets taken away. I'm a born-again ornithologist. I was an ornithologist as a child with my mother. My mother's a member of the RSPB and has been for 40 years. And you know, my father's name is on a bench somewhere in a RSPB reserve. And my wife and I have joined the RSPB during lockdown. I think we're up to about 50 varieties of bird we've seen, which has been fabulous. We've got photographs of some of them, of which I occasionally bore Michelle. But it has given us an outlet we haven't had before. Now, I want you to do something different. I talked in the last presentation about whether or not we should do more and get more people involved with writing. And so I'd like to talk about why you should write. For all the reasons above, as a distraction, as a good piece of mental mindfulness, but also as a way of making sense of what's going on in the world. And actually, I think in the last Zoom session I did, I read the poem, the first thing I wrote for my wife on our first date, which is, I tell you what, it's great, guys. If you can write poetry, definitely good in the relationship stakes. Anyway, moving on. Oh, I think it is, Michelle. So there is an attachment on this Zoom session that you can take away or download. And this is something that I wrote as a handout for a 3-session poetry workshop that Michelle and I did in the community at the start of 19, I think. It's going back now. And what I want to do is talk about some of the rules of poetry. And see, where we say the rules of poetry, this is where I have a bit of fun, because I'm of the opinion that my definition of poetry is breaking the rules without breaking the rules. You have to know what the rules are in poetry, because then you know when you can break them, when you can bend them, when you can ignore them, and when you can follow them. So it is important to have some guidelines to see whoever else has done stuff before. You know, you could look back at Andrew Marvell and Wordsworth and Byron, and you can get a certain amount of input out of it. You could also look at modern rap records, which are as close to poetry, although they are a slightly different form. They use similar techniques. Rhyming. Rhyming is one of those things that people get very het up about with poetry. To rhyme or not to rhyme, when to rhyme, how to rhyme. And I'm sure my mother would tell you it's not poetry if it doesn't rhyme. That's not at all true. Also, there are different forms of rhymes. So I have a few in that presentation that are worth mentioning. You can have rhymes at the end of lines. If you take Macbeth, by the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. Great. It's a very simple rhyme. Also, just a tiny bit predictable. Not that I'm saying there's anything wrong with Shakespeare, but just a little bit. It's a little bit predictable. You could have internal rhymes with inside the same line. That's when it starts to get a little bit more like rap. So if you take something like, if ever there was no tomorrow, would there be an end to sorrow? Would you have no more time past when all things end with atoms blast? Just having those internal rhymes inside the lines, you can do more of it, but it just gives you an idea. Slant rhymes are when we don't rhyme the whole word, but we rhyme part of it. So we could rhyme the vowel sound, or we can rhyme the consonant sound. So if you think about every evening, pints of beer are drunk, then late at night at home, my soul will slink. Drunk and slink rhyme purely on the consonant sound, not on the vowel sound. So you have choices there, and now suddenly becomes a little bit richer. And we talk about rich rhymes. So homonyms, words that are spelt differently but sound the same. So sign on the dotted line, make your mark here. Did cowardice make him walk away, or did he not hear? It's here and here in the sound, but the consonants, but the meaning of the words are different. You can also have, I'm being hassled by my iPad, sorry. So honestly, I was telling a colleague the other day that I was sad they were leaving work. And I was really heartbroken they were leaving, and she was leaving the company. And my iPad started asking me if I wanted to talk to Samaritans, because it picked up the words sad and heartbroken. And I thought, this is weird. Technology should not be this clever. Anyway, rhymes, which are words that look the same, but actually sound different. So they look like a rhyme, but they don't sound like a rhyme. So you could use the example, you set my heart against the trembling bough, a fragile thing, but your love was too rough. They've actually got exactly the same structure, but they don't sound the same, but it's still a rhyme. And then you can use the same word over and over again, identical rhymes. So that's the rhyming part. Rhythm and structure is where it gets a bit more funky. So there are a wealth of rhyming types of structural types in poems. We're all very, very well aware of a sonnet, and I'll sort of talk to sonnets a little bit later. But a sonnet is 14 lines. Now, there's a Petrarchan sonnet and there's a Shakespearean sonnet. So actually, even sonnets aren't the same. The ABC or ABC are all different in the different sorts of Shakespearean or Petrarchan sonnet. You use capital letters and small letters to show where things are repeated and where they are repeat sounded or repeat lined. So there is a thing called a triolet or a triolet. I've got an example. Actually, that's not a triolet. That's wrong. Oh, well, never mind. But all of these rhymes are saying, let's do something someone's done before. I've got some examples of poems which I'll read in a minute and tell you that they are standard structured rhymes of something that someone has done for 100 years or 200 years or 400 years. A lot of modern poetry doesn't follow the structural norms, and you can also make up your own norms. And that's the important thing. If the poetry works, then there's nothing wrong with the poetry. If when you hand that poem to someone else and they feel something, see something, almost taste something, and remember, there are five senses. You can write to five senses. You don't just have to write to what you see or think. You can write to what you feel. You can write to what you smell. You can write to all of your senses. Inside the lines themselves, we have also the shape of the syllables and where the stresses are on. And this is typically English poetry. If you get some other forms of poetry, their stressing is different. But if you took typically English poetry, Shakespeare, you've probably heard of, or if not, you will in a second, iambic pentameter. So Shakespeare wrote in iambs, in 5 metrical feet. So there were 5 syllables in each line of his work. And he would write in iambs, which is 2 syllables, soft then hard. So shall I compare thee to a summer's day is a typical piece of iambic pentameter. The opposite of an iamb is a trochee, and that's 2 syllables, hard then soft. The most famous trochaic line of poetry is tiger, tiger burning bright in the forest of the night. It doesn't sound out the same way that a Shakespeare sonnet does. Interestingly, Shakespeare was kind of bringing up the rear a little bit by about 2,000 years, because there is a piece of poetry which is a lot older, and everybody will know it now from the stories of the Wooden Horse of Troy and from the Odyssey and the Iliad, and that is the work of Homer. Supposedly from 500 to 600 BC, probably only written down then, originally purely spoken. It's 26,000 lines of hexameter poetry, so 7 metrical feet in each line, 26,000 lines, and it used to be not written down. And here's a shocker, they think Homer was actually a lady, not a bloke. That's the latest sort of literary concept, that the editor that actually finally wrote it all down was probably female, not male. So, but Homer was responsible for creating, through this poetry and through the tales of heroism, the first Hellenic homeland and bringing the Greek islands together into one nation of Greece, in the same way that this is very common. Goethe, the German poet, was partly responsible for bringing together the German homeland from individual principality states. We do it through storytelling. Storytelling is much more powerful than you think. So I'll read a couple more poems and stop talking now for a minute. Well, not stop talking, but stop talking. Let me share my second screen again. This is a sonnet. It's called Song of the Stones. We linger as the rays turn into rain. The cooling shade within the verdant space is the only constant. We walk in grace between uneven stones. The past remains just out of reach, inscribed as messages, poems of love and loss. That history of a transient, growing London, glory in all its majesty. The passages are like walking through time. We stop to read, to decode the meaning of a family buried in the bower, yearning to see each personal cipher, a secret code, to show respect, deference, and longing. As we tarry, we feel a bond forming. If you can read that on the screen, you'll see I did something which is how Shakespeare gets away with writing the same stuff over and over again. There are 2 extra things to do with poetry layout, and that is caesura and enjambment. Enjambment is when you wrap the meaning from one line to the next, and caesura is when you have pauses in the middle of the line. So you don't read, you don't write, we linger as the rays turn into rain, the cooling shade within the verdant space. is the only constant we walk in grace. Between uneven stones, the past remains. Because that is literally the rhyming structure. But to read it, and when you read Shakespeare, if you read the iambic pentameter, it runs across the lines, which is why you can't tell he's written it as iambic pentameter when it's spoken. It's only when you see it, you can see the structure that's there. So again, I would read, we linger as the rays turn into rain. The cooling shade within the verdant space is the only constant, Cesura. We walk in grace between uneven stones, Cesura. The past remains enjambment, just out of reach. So that's how you get the thing to flow without having to stick to the letter of the law. I'll read something else I wrote for the park, which I was quite moved with. And in the first year when we started talking about the war graves, this is an example of a villanelle. And a villanelle and a terzanelle are two forms of Italian rhyming poems that have a repetitious nature in them. And the repetition itself is quite, it's very set, it's very prescribed. You have to put lines in certain places, but it actually adds to the meaning of something when you're trying to have something that's repetitious. And I think when you see the war dead, and when you see what happened in World War I, and you see how we kept not learning our lessons, yes, your generals are behind you, 26 miles behind you. They're not at the front line, you know, falling on bullets and bayonets. This structure lent itself to it. And what's more, my name is Brooks. And therefore, when I found the name in here, it's rung a bell with me. It's called Samuel Alf James Brooks. S.A.J. Brooks, 134281, Gunner, Depot 1, Royal Garrison. I see my name and stare. I am undone. A volunteer who left to fight the Hun, Samuel, a death plaque sent to your son, S.A.J. Brooks, 134281. I read the words of those on Gatling gun, life under fire made targets of each man. I see my name and stare. I am undone. Dense smoke, beware as you are overrun. Yards are lost, then taken back again. S.A.J. Brooks, 134281. No country walk on the road to Verdun, but cold and dark and lethal on the Somme. I see my name and stare, I am undone. I bow and marvel at what you have done, a victim of their so-called master plan. S.A.J. Brooks, 134281. I see my name and stare, I am undone. Sometimes the form helps the poem write itself. I'm going to stop sharing. Hang on. I'd now like to talk about poetry in society. We've got time for a few more, so I won't overrun, so we'll be time to talk. But what is the purpose of poetry in society? I'm not sure how many saw the recent inauguration of the new president. There was a young girl there who read a poem out, and it was moving. And it was quite rap in nature, and it was a stunning piece of oral art. But this is what I wrote when asked to write something about the building work next door. Shadow. Little flourishes in the darkness, a terrible epitaph for a towering mistake, as the gasworks leak their last lament. The denizens of concrete and cladding threaten the very light that shines upon daisy, cowslip, and kidney vetch. The definition of being insane, making the same mistake again and again, expecting somehow a different refrain. The song forever remains the same when the bulldozer and the crane gate crash the green cemetery park lanes. They will try and steal our sun, the very life energy of everyone, the powerhouse swelling our green lungs, each leafy limb a lifeline, a rung upon the ladder of a cleaner city. The moors, the pity, the air less gritty, asthma at bay, the children play in the chlorophyll cathedral. If St. William have their way, not just their way, no green woodpecker's chuckle would replay with the habitat darkened and grimy grey, our urban landscape set for more decay. Build, if you will, have your fill, but remember balance in your will. The state you leave when you have gone, no skips and scaffolding when we're alone, curtail the shadow that you project, a silver lining. Why not reflect with smaller buildings, more in keeping? So every day the sun is sweeping across the landscape, green and calm. Show your worth, belay your harm, think about your legacy, and leave the trees their right to be. As I say, I think you have an option here to try putting some words down yourself. And here is my call to arms. I have one more to read, but that's my swan song. Have you written? How do you express yourself? Would you share it? Would you share it with Ken in the park? Would you like some workshops in the future? Would you like to do readings? Have you written bespoke poetry for certain occasions? A wedding or an anniversary, a birthday. I write poems for my colleagues' children when they're born, and they're called acrostics. So it spells down the side the name of the child and a little bit of definition as to where their names come from, and they keep them as birth presents, which is quite nice. What I would suggest now is the new gang of 3, which is great. So there's going to be more scope. My time is limited. I obviously have a day job. And I think having 3 dedicated artists working here is going to give so much more scope. So I think my call to you would be to reach out to the park and try to share what you are, if you produce something, because I think there's an opportunity here to build something bigger with the tiny stepping stone we've begun with could turn into not something big enough to block out the light, because we think we've decided that's definitely wrong, but into something slightly bigger and something more permanent. I'm going to close with one more reading and then we'll open it for questions. I need to share one more time. Last time. And this is called Swan Song. It is not all that get to write their own swan song, to chisel fine words upon a virtual gravestone, listening to all those nice things people say after the event behind closed doors as the body slides softly into the earth below. Yeah, here I am, penning posy, still nice and cozy, above ground in a spotlit 21st century garret. I shall list the things I will miss, the pressure once a month to hit a brief, though it was fun really, and such relief when finally binary flew across the Ethernet. And my clients were satisfied, accuracy corrected, the species inspected within the lines of lyrics, words without music, singing songs of nature. Within more minutes on the clock, what was next? What epic tomes of towering heroes have graced the page? Gentle epistles to flowers or thistles? Or would I rage at the demise of the light from freshly minted flats, the bats struggling to find homes as the city closes in? Where would I begin to even scratch the surface? No, the time has come and the time is right. There are shoes to fill and new voices to hear, echoing like laughing children from the toppled tombs. They all discover the wonder and awe I did before. There is a tear or two, but memory will flood back to me when I consider all those couplets penned and the countless friends made along the path. This, in the end, is my epitaph.